The woman who arrived at the gates of the Langston Ranch on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1879 looked like she had been chewed up by the Texas plains and spat out without ceremony. Her dress torn at the hem, her boots so worn through at the sole that the dry red dirt had worked its way between her toes, and her eyes dark and determined and burning with something that refused to go quiet fixed on the ranch house ahead of her, as though she had willed it into existence through sheer desperate need. Theresa Redmond was 24 years old, and she had not eaten a proper meal in 3 days. She had walked 11 miles from the town of Caldwell Creek, which itself was barely more than a collection of sun-bleached buildings hunched together against the wind, and she had walked those 11 miles because the man at the general store, a heavy-set fellow with flour on his apron and not much kindness in his face, had told her that Homer Langston was the only rancher in the county who might take on extra help without asking too many questions. She had not asked what questions he meant. She had simply thanked him, bought nothing because she had nothing to buy with, and started walking south. The ranch spread out before her in the way that only real working land does, with purpose and honesty and a certain hard beauty that had nothing to do with decoration. The main house was a wide, low-set structure of cedar and limestone, the kind of building that had been added onto over the years rather than planned all at once, with a broad covered porch facing east to catch the morning shade. Beyond it stood a long bunkhouse, a barn painted red though the paint had faded to something closer to rust, 2 corrals where horses moved in slow, deliberate circles, and further out, cattle dotting the rolling grassland like dark seeds scattered by a careless hand. Theresa stopped at the gate and gripped the top rail of it to steady herself. She had not let herself feel the hunger or the exhaustion until this moment, and now both of them rose up inside her like water coming over a levee. She breathed slowly. She was not going to arrive at this man's door looking like she was about to fall over, even if she was. She pushed the gate open, walked the long path toward the main house, and climbed the 3 porch steps with a deliberate, measured pace. She knocked twice, then waited. The door opened and she looked up into the face of a man who was not at all what she had expected. Homer Langston was 31 years old, and he had the kind of face that had spent years in the sun and wind and did not apologize for it. He was lean without being spare, broad in the shoulder, with dark hair pushed back from his forehead, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in perhaps 4 days. His eyes were light brown, almost amber, and they looked at her with an expression that was not unwelcoming but was careful, the way a man's eyes get when he has learned to take stock of a situation before he commits to it. He was still wearing his work gloves. He had clearly been pulled away from something. "Can I help you?" he asked. Theresa straightened her spine. "My name is Theresa Redmond. I heard in town that you might need help on your ranch. I can cook, I can clean, I can mend, I can do laundry, I can work a garden, and if you need someone to help with lighter, stable work, I can do that too. I am not asking for charity. I am asking for work, and I will earn every cent you pay me." Homer looked at her for a long moment. Not the way some men looked at a woman alone on their doorstep with suspicion, or with the kind of slow, crawling assessment that made a woman want to fold into herself. He looked at her the way a man looks at a situation he is genuinely trying to understand. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "Caldwell Creek. Before that, Abilene. Before that, various places." She kept her voice level. "I have been traveling since January. My husband died last autumn from a fever. I have no family in the territory, and the money I had ran out 2 weeks ago." She did not say it for sympathy. She said it because it was the truth, and she did not see the value in hiding the truth from a man you were asking to trust you. Homer's expression shifted, not to pity exactly, to something more considered. He pulled his gloves off and tucked them through his belt. "Have you eaten today?" he asked. It was such a direct question and so gently put that it nearly undid her composure entirely. "No," she said. "Come in," he said, and stepped back from the door. The inside of the ranch house was exactly what she might have expected from a single working man. meaning it was functional and clean enough to demonstrate a basic respect for order but warm and lived in a way that spoke of someone who had not been particularly concerned with appearances. There was a stone fireplace along one wall, a table large enough for 6 but set for 1, a set of shelves that held a combination of practical things like rope and tools, and a few books with cracked spines. The kitchen was through an open doorway, and she could smell coffee that had been sitting long enough to get strong. Homer led her to the kitchen and gestured to a chair at the kitchen table, and then without much ceremony, he went about the business of putting together a plate of food. Cold biscuits from that morning, a thick cut of cured ham that he sliced himself, a jar of blackberry preserves, and a tin cup of that strong coffee. He set it in front of her and sat down across the table and did not watch her eat, which she appreciated more than she could say. He looked at his own hands instead, and she ate with as much dignity as a starving woman can manage, which took some effort, but she managed it. When she was done, she sat up straight and looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "That was very kind." "About the work." One corner of his mouth turned up slightly. "You want to talk business before you've had time to breathe. I do not see the advantage in delay." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in the quality of his attention changed. "I have a cook and a housekeeper, but she is my neighbor's wife and she only comes 3 times a week. I could use someone here full time. There is a room at the back of the house, small but clean. I would pay you $8 a month plus room and board." $8 a month was not a fortune by any measure, but it was honest, and it was more than nothing, and it meant a roof and regular meals. "10, Theresa said. Homer blinked. "I said I can cook, clean, mend, launder, tend a garden, and do lighter stable work. That is the labor of at least 2 people, $10 a month." There was a pause that stretched out long enough to become interesting, and then Homer said, "9. "Done," Theresa said. They shook hands across the kitchen table, and that was how Theresa Redmond came to work at the Langston Ranch in the spring of 1879. She took possession of the back room that afternoon. It was indeed small, but Homer had not lied about the clean. There was a narrow iron bedstead with a decent mattress, a washstand with a white ceramic basin, a small chest of drawers, and a single window that looked out toward the eastern pasture. In the evening light the grass was golden and the cattle moved through it slowly, and the sky behind them went through half a dozen shades of orange and pink before it settled into dark blue. Theresa sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel it. All of it. The relief of the food in her stomach. The relief of walls and a roof. The grief that was always there underneath everything. The grief for James, her husband, who had been a good man and who had died too young and too fast, and had left her in a world that was not designed to make things easy for a woman alone. She let herself feel it, and then she folded it back up and put it away, because that was what you did when you had work to do in the morning. She was up before dawn. Homer came into the kitchen at first light and stopped short because there was a fire already built and coffee already made and biscuit dough already mixed, and Theresa was standing at the stove cracking eggs into a cast iron skillet with the calm efficiency of someone who had been doing this for years. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, and then he said, "You did not have to start this early." "I know," she said. "How do you take your eggs?" "However they come," he said, which she suspected was the truth. She scrambled them with a little butter and served them with the biscuits and a thick slab of bacon, and Homer sat at the kitchen table and ate, and she stood at the washstand and ate her own plate standing, because that was the habit she had developed over years of working in other people's kitchens. "Sit down," Homer said, without looking up from his plate. She looked at him. "You live here," he said. "Sit at the table." She sat at the table. They ate breakfast in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which she found slightly surprising. She had expected it to be awkward, sharing morning meals with a man she had known for less than 24 hours. It was not. It was simply quiet, the way mornings in working houses tend to be before the day gets moving. After breakfast, Homer went to work and Theresa went to work, and for the first 2 weeks that was essentially the whole of it. Work and meals and the brief ordinary interactions that come from sharing a space. And occasionally in the evenings, Homer would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and Theresa would sit at the other end with her mending, and they would watch the last light leave the sky and talk or not talk in equal measure. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn about a person when you are not interrogating them but simply paying attention. She learned that he had inherited the ranch from his father, who had built it up from nothing over 30 years and died of a bad heart when Homer was 26, leaving him the land and the cattle and the debt that went with both. She learned that he had two ranch hands, a young man named Cody who was 19 and enthusiastic in the way that 19-year-olds are about almost everything, and an older man named Rufus who had worked the ranch since Homer's father's time and who spoke rarely but moved through his work like a man who had been doing it long enough that it had become a part of how he breathed. She learned that Homer read in the evenings when he could, that he had a preference for serious literature alongside practical books on cattle management and land survey, and that he had a habit of running one hand through his hair when he was thinking hard about something. She also learned that he was fair, not the performative fairness of a man who wants to be seen as fair, but the real kind, the kind that is simply a structural part of how a person operates. He was fair with his ranch hands, and he was fair with his neighbors, and he was fair with her, in the terms he had agreed to and in the basic daily matter of how he spoke to her. She had not always been treated fairly. She appreciated it more than she let on. He learned things about her too, though she was more contained and he was careful not to push. He learned that she had grown up in Missouri, the eldest daughter of a tenant farmer, and that she had come to Texas at 18 with James Redmond, who had been a kind and decent man with large ambitions that the world had not quite cooperated with. He learned that she had no children, which she mentioned once with a stillness in her voice that told him it was a tender place, and he did not press it. He learned that she had a quick and precise mind, that she did not use 10 words when 5 would do, that she had strong opinions about the proper way to make a pie crust and was not shy about stating them, and that she could look at a disorganized supply shed and have it sorted and inventoried within 2 hours in a way that made him feel slightly embarrassed about how long it had been disorganized. In the 3rd week of May, a situation arose that shifted things between them in a way that neither of them planned. It was a Thursday afternoon, and Homer was out on the South Range with Cody looking at a section of fence that had come down. Rufus had ridden into Caldwell Creek for supplies. Theresa was in the kitchen garden at the back of the house, on her knees in the warm dirt, transplanting seedlings, when she heard the creak of the front gate and stood and went around to see who had come. There were 2 men on horseback at the end of the path, and she could tell from the way they sat their horses and the way they were looking at the ranch house that they were not there for anything good. One of them was heavyset with a gray beard and cold eyes, and the other was younger and leaner with a way of holding himself that suggested he was looking for an excuse for trouble. "Looking for Langston," the heavyset one said. "He is out on the range," Theresa said. She did not move toward them. She stood at the corner of the house with the kind of stillness that is not passivity but positioning. "We will wait," the man said, and swung down from his horse without being invited to do so. "I'm afraid that will not be convenient today," Theresa said. "If you leave your name, I will tell him you called." The younger man grinned in a way that she did not like at all. "Lady, we did not ask if it was convenient." "Nevertheless," Theresa said. The heavy-set man looked at her with the kind of assessment that is meant to make a person feel small. "You got a name?" "Theresa Redmond. I work for Mr. Langston. And I am telling you that today is not a convenient day for visitors. Mr. Langston will be in town on Saturday morning, and if you have business with him, that is a suitable time to discuss it." There was a tense little moment in which the 2 men weighed something against something else, and then the heavy-set man put one boot back in the stirrup and remounted. "You tell Langston that Del Harker was here," he said, "and that he is running out of time to make a decision on that water rights matter." "I will tell him," Theresa said, and did not move until they had ridden back through the gate and down the road a sufficient distance. When Homer came in at sundown, she told him about it over supper, matter-of-factly and with all the relevant details. He listened without interrupting, and his expression went through several things she could not quite name. "Del Harker," he said when she was done. "That was the name he gave." Homer was quiet for a moment. "He is trying to buy the water rights to the creek that runs through the south corner of my land. He has been pushing on it for 2 years. My father refused to sell, and so have I. He does not seem like a man who is used to being told no." "He is not." Homer looked at her across the table. "You handled that well." "I told him to leave and he left," Theresa said. "I would not call that particularly extraordinary. Most people, when Harker shows up on their doorstep, find more pressing things to look at than his face," Homer said. "I have met unpleasant men before," Theresa said simply. Homer looked at her with that considering expression again, the one she had started to recognize as being a particular quality of attention he brought to things that genuinely interested him. "I expect you have," he said. The Del Harker situation did not resolve quickly. Over the following weeks, Harker's men were seen near the south fence line twice, and on one occasion a section of that fence was found cut in a way that let 40 head of cattle drift into the neighboring pasture. It was the kind of harassment that stopped just short of something you could take before a judge, and Homer dealt with it with a patience that had steel inside it. Theresa found herself becoming a part of these discussions in the evenings, not because Homer invited her in any formal sense, but because she was there and she listened and she thought carefully. And one evening she said something that made him pause. "He wants the water rights because if he controls the water, he controls the land around it," she said. "But you do not have to sell the rights to address whatever specific concern is driving him. If he is worried about access for his cattle during the dry season, there is a middle arrangement, a shared use agreement rather than a sale. You keep the rights, he gets seasonal access, and you have something in writing that you both have to honor." Homer looked at her across the porch in the dusk. "Where did you learn about land agreements?" "My father dealt with 3 of them in Missouri when I was growing up," she said. "And James did a great deal of reading about property law when we were planning to file a homestead claim." She paused. "Before he got sick." "That is a fair idea," Homer said after a moment. "It might not satisfy Harker." "No, but it would take the legs out from under his argument and make it harder for him to justify the harassment to whatever judge he might eventually try to convince." Homer nodded slowly. "I will write to my attorney in San Antonio." It was a small thing, one practical suggestion offered and considered. But after that the evening conversations became something more, a genuine exchange of ideas about the ranch, about the land, about the various problems and considerations that came with running a working spread in a county that had its share of difficult neighbors and unpredictable weather, and the ordinary grinding complexity of keeping 100 things moving at once. Theresa discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she found these conversations genuinely engaging. She had a mind that liked problems, liked turning them over and looking at them from different angles, and Homer Langston was a man who did the same thing, and who, furthermore, did not seem to find it odd or inconvenient that a woman was doing it alongside him. Summer arrived with the particular ferocity of the Texas plains, the heat settling over everything like a physical weight, the air dry and bright and relentless. Theresa adapted her work schedule accordingly, rising earlier to get the heavy cooking done before the kitchen became unbearable, doing outdoor tasks in the early morning and late evening, resting in the worst of the afternoon heat as Homer himself did when the work allowed it. It was during one of those hot July afternoons, when the ranch had gone quiet and the cattle stood in the shade of the few trees, and even the horses seemed to be moving slower than usual, that Theresa sat in the shade of the porch and pulled out the small writing case she kept under her bed and began a letter she had been meaning to write for some time. She was writing to her sister Clara, who had stayed in Missouri when Theresa left, and who she had not seen in 6 years. They had exchanged letters sporadically, the letters getting further apart as Theresa's circumstances became harder, and she found it more difficult to describe what her life looked like without causing worry. The last letter she had sent had been in January from Abilene, brief and careful. She wrote the new letter slowly, taking her time. She told Clara about Caldwell Creek and about the ranch and about the work, and she found herself, somewhat unexpectedly, writing 2 full paragraphs about Homer Langston. Not romantically, not in any way she would have been embarrassed to read aloud, but with a specificity and warmth that, when she went back and read over what she had written, made her sit still for a moment with the pen resting against her chin. She folded the letter and did not examine the feeling too closely. There was work to do. It was August when the thing happened that neither of them had planned for and both of them felt coming. Cody, the young ranch hand, had managed to get himself badly thrown from a horse that was not quite as broken as he had believed it to be, and had landed badly on his wrist and shoulder. He was not seriously hurt, but he was not able to work for 10 days, and in those 10 days Homer was stretched thinner than usual, doing the work of 2 men on the range while Rufus covered what he could. Theresa started doing more. She took over the chicken and egg work entirely, expanded the garden, handled the supply inventory and the account keeping that normally sat in a pile on Homer's desk until he could get to it. And on the 4th day, when she looked out from the kitchen garden and saw that the east corral fence had a post that was working loose and the horses were testing it, she went and got the tools and fixed it herself. Homer came back in the late afternoon and saw the repaired fence and stood looking at it for a moment before he came inside. "You fixed the east corral post," he said. "It was about to give," she said. "The gray mare had already pushed against it twice." "I was going to get to it this evening," he said. "I know," she said, "but I was already outside and I had the time." There was a pause, and then Homer said, "Theresa, you are already doing more than your position calls for." "I know that too," she said, and she looked up at him directly, which was something she had become comfortable doing in a way she had not been in the first weeks. "This ranch runs well when things get done, and it runs poorly when they do not. That matters to me. I do not fully understand why yet, but it does." The words landed between them and settled there with a kind of significance that made the air in the kitchen feel slightly different than it had before. Homer looked at her for a long moment. His expression was doing that thing she had noticed, where multiple things were happening in it simultaneously, and she could only read part of what they were. "I am paying you $9 a month," he said. "That is not enough for what you do." "You could raise my wages," she said. "I could," he said. "I am going to," he paused, $12. She had been expecting 10. 12 caught her off guard enough that she blinked. "That is generous." "It is fair," he said. "There is a difference." She looked at him, this lean, thoughtful, complicated man who had opened his door to a starving stranger and given her work and now gave her fair wages and talked to her in the evenings as though her thoughts were worth hearing, and she felt something she had been very carefully not looking at move inside her like a shift in the earth. She understood with a quiet, settled certainty, in serious danger of being in love with Homer Langston. She did not do anything about this understanding. She put it away in the careful, disciplined way she had gotten very good at putting things away, and went on with her work. August moved into September and the heat began its slow retreat. The ranch work shifted with the season. The cattle needed to be sorted and counted, some of the older stock prepared for sale, the winter feed supplies assessed and ordered. Theresa had by now so thoroughly worked herself into the operational fabric of the ranch that Homer consulted her as a matter of course on the practical management side of things. The accounts, the supply ordering, the coordination with the neighboring ranchers' wives who formed the informal social and practical network of the county. She had become known in Caldwell Creek, which took some adjustment. When she had first arrived in the county she had been invisible, which was comfortable in its way. Now when she went to town with the wagon for supplies, people knew her name. Mrs. Garfield, who ran the dry goods store with her husband, had taken a particular liking to her and always had something to ask about. The minister and his wife invited her to Sunday services with a warmth that she found genuine. There was also, inevitably, talk. She was aware of it without being directly confronted by it. A young widow living and working in the home of an unmarried man was the kind of situation that produced opinions in small communities, and she understood that some of those opinions were not kind. She held her head up and did her work and let people form whatever conclusions they were going to form, because there was no point in being distressed about things that could not be changed. Homer was aware of the talk too. She knew this because one evening in early September he brought it up in his direct, unpreambled way. "People in town are talking," he said. "I know," she said. "It does not seem to bother you." "It bothers me some," she said honestly. "I do not like the implication. But I do not know what to do about it that does not involve either leaving or behaving as though I have done something wrong, and I have not done anything wrong." "No," Homer said, "you have not." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the darkening sky over the eastern pasture. "I want you to know that it would not be a reason for me to ask you to leave. Your position here is secure regardless of what people say." She looked at him. He was not looking at her, but his jaw was set in a way that told her he felt the weight of what he had just said. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I just wanted to be clear about it," he said. Another silence, but this one was different. There was something in it that felt like the space just before a door opens. Neither of them opened it that night. October arrived, and with it, the Del Harker situation came to a kind of resolution. Homer had taken Theresa's suggestion about the shared use agreement, had written to his attorney, and after several rounds of correspondence and one meeting in town that Homer attended with his attorney, and that Harker attended looking deeply unhappy, a formal written agreement was reached. Harker got seasonal access to the creek during July and August for his cattle. Homer retained the water rights in full. The harassment at the fence line stopped. Homer told her about the finalized agreement when he came back from town that afternoon, and she said good with a satisfaction that was entirely genuine. He sat down at the kitchen table and watched her finish rolling out a pie crust. "My attorney asked who had suggested the shared use framework," he said. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." He seemed surprised. "That a woman thought of it. That anyone thought of it before spending twice as much time and money as necessary," Homer said. "He is a good attorney, but he does not always think practically first." Theresa smiled at her pie crust. "Practical thinking is undervalued in general." "It is," Homer agreed, and he was smiling too. She could hear it in his voice without looking up. "Theresa." Something in the way he said her name made her look up. He was looking at her across the kitchen table with an expression she had not seen on him before, clear and careful and very direct. "I find myself in a situation I did not expect," he said. She set the rolling pin down. "I want to be honest with you because I think you are owed honesty, and because I think you are a person who handles it better than most." He paused, clearly measuring his words with the same care he measured everything. "I have thought about this for several months, and I have tried to talk myself out of it, and I have not been able to." Her heart was doing something very inconvenient. "I am in love with you," he said. "I do not say that to put you in an uncomfortable position. You work for me, and I am aware that puts a particular kind of weight on what I am saying. If you do not feel the same, I want nothing to change between us, and I want you to understand that completely and believe it. Your place here is not conditional on anything except that you want to be here." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a bird was making a sound in the oak tree by the east corral, and the late afternoon light was coming through the window in long golden bars and catching the dust in the air. "Homer," she said. "You do not have to say anything tonight," he said. "I mean that." "Homer," she said again, and her voice was not quite steady. "I have been in love with you since August." The expression on his face was something she was going to remember for the rest of her life. He stood up from the table. She was standing on the other side of it with flour on her hands and her heart in her throat. He came around the table and he stopped just in front of her, and he was very careful and very present in the way he always was, this man who did not do anything carelessly. "May I?" he said. She answered him by stepping forward, and then his arms were around her and her face was against his chest, and she could feel the steady, solid beat of his heart, and she closed her eyes and let herself have it. This feeling she had been folding away for months. Let it unfold all at once. He held her for a long time without moving, one hand at her back and one hand very gently against her hair, and she thought about how much the world had asked her to manage alone over the last year, and how extraordinary it felt to be held like this, carefully and without apology. Eventually she stepped back and looked up at him, and they were both slightly undone in the way that only the most honest emotions can make you. "The pie crust," she said, and her voice was shaky with something that was mostly happiness. Homer laughed. It was the first time she had heard him really laugh, and it transformed his face completely, and she thought this is the thing. They were not impulsive people, either of them. They had both been shaped by hard things into a kind of practical groundedness that did not lend itself to rushing. But something had opened up between them that evening, and it did not close again. In the days that followed, there was a new quality to the ordinary routine of the ranch. The breakfast conversations were the same. The work was the same. The evening hours on the porch were the same. But there was a warmth running through all of it that had not been there before, and that neither of them tried to pretend was not there. He would find reasons to come into the kitchen in the afternoon, when there was no particular reason for him to be there. She began to understand that the slight softening around his eyes when he was looking at her from across a room was something she was allowed to notice and be glad of. He rode into town on a Wednesday morning 2 weeks after that evening in the kitchen, and came back with a small paper package which he set on the kitchen table in front of her without ceremony, and then went out again to the barn. She opened it to find a length of blue cotton fabric, good quality, the color of a clear sky in mid-morning. She pressed it between her hands and looked out the kitchen window at the barn and felt something that had no clean word for it, only the warm, complete weight of being known and thought of. She made herself a new dress from it and wore it to Sunday services the following week. Homer sat beside her in the pew, and that in itself was a kind of statement to the community that people noticed, and that she did not mind at all. Mrs. Garfield at the dry goods store found a moment to take her arm after the service and whisper, "My dear, it is about time," with a warmth that made Theresa laugh out loud. November arrived cool and crisp, and with it the beginning of the kind of talk that was not uncomfortable gossip, but something more forward-looking. Homer had taken to driving the ranch wagon himself when she needed to go to town rather than having Cody take her. And one afternoon in early November, while they were coming back from Caldwell Creek with a load of winter supplies, he said, with his eyes on the road ahead, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it carefully before you answer." "All right," she said. "Theresa, I would very much like for you to be my wife." The road stretched out ahead of them between the pale November grass and the wide pale sky, and she could hear the horses and the creak of the wagon, and far away the sound of a hawk somewhere high up. She was quiet for a moment, not because she did not know the answer, but because the moment deserved to be felt fully. "Homer," she said, "I know it has not been very long in the way that most people count time," he said, and there was a tension in his voice that was careful and earnest and human. "I know you have had a year that asked a great deal of you. I am not asking you to rush into anything, but I want you to know that I mean it as completely as I have ever meant anything." "I know you do," she said. "That is actually one of the things I love about you. You do not say things you do not mean." A pause. "Then you will consider it." "I already have," she said. "Yes." He turned to look at her then, taking his eyes off the road entirely, and the expression on his face was so wholly unguarded that it nearly made her reach out and touch his face, which she restrained herself from doing only because they were on a public road. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. The horse took the wagon around a gentle curve in the road, and the evening light came down warm and copper-colored over the whole of the land, and neither of them said anything else for a little while. But it was the most full silence she had ever sat inside. They were married on the 14th of December, 1879, at the church in Caldwell Creek, which was a small building with honest wooden pews and a clear glass window behind the altar that looked out on the winter sky. The minister performed the ceremony with the kind of genuine warmth that made it feel like more than a transaction between a person and the law, and the witnesses were Rufus and Cody and Mrs. Garfield and her husband, and 3 or 4 of the neighboring families who had come to know Theresa over the course of the months she had been at the ranch. Theresa wore her blue cotton dress with a white collar she had sewn on especially, and she carried a small bunch of dried flowers because that was what December offered, and she had never been a person who required things to be other than what they were. Homer stood at the front of the church in his best suit, which fit him well and which had clearly been recently brushed, and when she walked up the aisle toward him and he looked at her, the look on his face was one she was going to carry inside her for the rest of her life. It was not a complicated look. It was simply joy, clear and complete, the look of a man who is exactly where he wants to be and knows it. The minister asked the questions and they gave the answers, and when Homer put the plain gold band on her finger, his hands were perfectly steady, which she appreciated, and she felt that she could trust those hands with everything. Outside the church afterward, with the cold December air sharp and clean and the sky a brilliant winter blue, Mrs. Garfield embraced her with the enthusiasm of a woman who genuinely means it, and Rufus shook Homer's hand with the solemnity of a man who has known him for decades and is satisfied, and Cody nearly knocked Homer's hat off in his excitement to clap him on the back. They drove home to the ranch in the late afternoon light, just the 2 of them in the wagon, and the land around them was familiar and wide, and entirely their own. The ranch house had been cleaned within an inch of its life that morning. Theresa had insisted on it, and she had put the last of the dried wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen table. And when Homer built up the fire in the evening and they sat down to the supper she had prepared, it was the same kitchen table she had sat at when she arrived starving and unknown, and also it was utterly different. It was their table in their home. And the world was full of an ordinary magic that she had not known was this readily available until now. Winter settled over the ranch and they moved through it together, which was different from everything that had come before in the way that having a partner changes the fundamental texture of existence. Not that things became easy exactly, because ranch life in the Texas winter had its own challenges. The cold snaps that came down hard from the north, the cattle that needed tending through bad weather, the equipment that chose the worst moments to need repair. But the fundamental nature of facing things changed when you faced them with another person who was genuinely with you. They talked more in those winter evenings than she had ever talked with anyone. Not the careful, measured conversations of people still learning whether it was safe to say things, but the real kind, the kind that goes sideways into unexpected territories and reveals new corners and comes back around to something that matters. She told him things about her childhood in Missouri that she had never told anyone, about the cold winters in the tenant house and her father's quiet dignity in the face of grinding hardship, and he listened with the quality of attention that made you feel your experiences had weight. He told her about his father, who had been a formidable man by all accounts, and who Homer had spent a great deal of his young life trying to satisfy, and about the complicated grief of losing him before certain things between them could be resolved. He told her about the loneliness of the years after, which surprised her because he wore it so well that she would not have known it was there. "Did you never think of marrying?" She asked him one January evening, sitting by the fire with the wind outside making itself known. "I thought about it in the abstract," he said. "I never found a person I wanted to think about it concretely with." He paused. "Until you came to my door looking like you were prepared to argue with the wind itself if it got in your way," she laughed. "I was not that fierce." "You were exactly that fierce," he said. "You were also terrified and trying not to show it, and you showed up anyway. I found that remarkable." She looked at the fire. "I did not have a choice. Everyone has a choice. Yours could have been to sit down in the road. You did not." She looked at him then, this man who saw her so clearly and made her feel not exposed by that but steadied. "I am glad I did not," she said. "So am I," he said. "Considerably." Spring came back to the land in the way it does on the Texas plains. Not gently, but all at once. The grass going from brown to green seemingly overnight, and the wildflowers coming up through the pastures in yellows and reds and purples that made the whole landscape look as though it was trying to make up for the austerity of winter. Theresa discovered she was expecting a child in April. She had suspected for 2 weeks before she was certain enough to say anything, and she held the knowledge carefully during those 2 weeks, turning it over in her hands the way you handle something precious and breakable. She had wanted children. She had thought in the dark year after James died that this might be among the things the world was not going to give her, and the thought had sat in her like a wound that would not quite close. She told Homer on a Sunday evening when the last of the sunset was still holding a thin gold line along the western horizon and the first stars were coming out. She said it simply, because she did not know another way to say it. "I am going to have a baby." The stillness that came over him for a moment before he moved was complete. Then he reached out and took her hand in both of his and looked at her with something that was past words, past the careful measuring intelligence she was so accustomed to seeing in his face, something that was just feeling all the way through. "Theresa," he said, and his voice was not quite right, and she understood that it was because he was holding something large and it was almost too much to hold. "Are you pleased?" she asked, though she could see perfectly well that he was. "I do not have the word for what I am," he said honestly. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat there in the evening quiet while the sky went dark and the stars increased, and the land stretched out around the house in all directions, theirs and familiar and full of the future. The pregnancy progressed through the summer with the ordinary complicated grace of such things. Theresa continued to work, because she was Theresa and she was not someone who stopped simply because things were different. Though she was sensible about it, and Homer was careful without being hovering, which she appreciated. She organized the household so that the heavier work was covered without requiring her to do things that were not wise to do, and she took on more of the account-keeping and the correspondence which suited her entirely and which, she had come to realize over the past year, was work that had previously been done imperfectly and intermittently, and that her attention had genuinely improved. Cody, who had turned 20 and was getting more confident by the month, had started courting a girl from a farm 3 miles north, a cheerful and capable young woman named Me, who Theresa liked immediately, and who came to visit on Sunday afternoons, with the shy excitement of someone exploring the early edges of something large and good. Theresa saw in Me and Cody the particular brightness that she recognized, the brightness of two people just beginning to understand what they mean to each other, and it made her glad in a way that had no sharp edges. Rufus, who had said nothing about any of these developments because Rufus never said much about anything that was not directly related to the cattle or the fence line, had given Homer a single nod of approval on the morning after the wedding, and that had been his full commentary on the matter, which was also, somehow, exactly right. In August, a letter came from Clara. It was the longest letter Clara had ever written to her, 12 full pages in Clara's small, careful handwriting, and it contained everything that 6 years of increasing distance had accumulated between them. Clara had married a man named Hartwell who farmed outside a town called Millbrook in Missouri, and they had 3 children, and Clara's life had been its own complicated thing that Theresa had not fully known because Theresa had been managing her own complicated thing. The letter was full of the ordinary texture of those years, the children growing, the farm work, the small community dramas that accumulate into a life, and at the end of it Clara wrote, "I read what you wrote about Homer Langston 3 times, and each time I was happier for you than the time before. You have always deserved someone who treats you like a person of consequence, Theresa. From what you write, it sounds very much like you have found one. I want to come and see you. Hartwell says we can come in the spring if the winter goes well." Theresa read this letter twice herself and then folded it with care and wrote back that evening 12 pages of her own, and at the end she wrote that she was expecting a baby in November and she very much hoped Clara would come. Homer came in while she was writing and asked who the letter was to, and she told him about Clara, and he listened and then said, "Invite them for spring. I will make sure there is room." "I already did," she said. He smiled. "Of course you did." November came and the baby arrived on the 8th, which was a cold, bright morning with a hard blue sky and frost on the grass. And it was not easy in the way that childbirth is not easy. But the midwife who came was competent and calm, and Homer was somewhere in the house the whole time in the useful way, present but not in the way. And when it was over and the midwife put the baby in Theresa's arms, Theresa looked down at the red, indignant, perfectly formed face of her son and felt something that had no relationship to any other thing she had ever felt. "A boy," the midwife said, already moving to clean up. "Good strong lungs on him." The lungs were indeed making themselves known. Homer came in shortly after and sat on the edge of the bed, and Theresa lifted the baby slightly so he could see the face, and Homer looked at his son for a long moment without saying anything, and then he looked at Theresa with an expression she would never in her life have the words for. "He looks like he is already annoyed about something," Homer said. "I believe that is just how they look," Theresa said. "He is remarkable," Homer said, very quietly. "He is," Theresa agreed. They named him William James Langston. The William was for Homer's father, a reconciliation of sorts. The James was for Theresa's husband who had died, because he had been a good man and she did not believe in pretending people had not existed. And Homer had not only agreed to this without hesitation, but had suggested it himself, which said everything that needed to be said about who Homer Langston was. William James Langston was a baby of considerable opinions and excellent health, and from the first weeks made it very clear that the ranch was going to have to adjust itself around him rather than the other way around. Theresa adapted with the same competent directness she brought to every other challenge, and Homer proved to be, as she might have predicted, a father who took the business of it entirely seriously, and without any of the distant paternal posturing that she had observed in other men. He was involved and present, and he held his son with a careful tenderness that made something in Theresa's chest go warm every time she saw it. Winter passed into the new year, 1881, and spring arrived, and with it, in April, Clara and Hartwell and their 3 children came by train to the nearest station, and then by rented wagon to Caldwell Creek, and then out to the Langston Ranch. And Theresa stood on the porch in the April morning and watched the wagon come up the road and felt the particular complicated joy of reunion with someone you have loved your whole life and been separated from too long. Clara was taller than Theresa remembered, or perhaps more solid, the kind of solid that comes from years of hard work on good land. She climbed down from the wagon and crossed the yard, and the 2 sisters held each other for a long time without speaking, and when they stepped back, there were tears on both their faces, and neither of them apologized for it. Hartwell was a solid, quiet man with a handshake that conveyed reliability, and Homer took to him immediately in the way that 2 practical-minded men of similar character sometimes do, circling each other briefly with the assessment of equals, and then settling into an ease that made conversation natural. The 3 children were 7, 5, and 3, and they took one look at the horses in the corral and forgot that they were in an unfamiliar place entirely. The visit lasted 2 weeks and it was full. Clara saw the ranch and the town and the church where Theresa had been married, and she sat up past midnight on the first 3 nights while the men had gone to bed, talking with Theresa at the kitchen table the way they had talked as girls in Missouri, covering everything that had accumulated and everything that mattered and a great deal in between. On the third night, Clara said, "Tell me about him." And Theresa told her. Not the short, careful version she might have written in a letter, but the whole of it. From the morning she had walked up the path to this house with her boots worn through to the bottom, and her pride intact through sheer force of will, to the kitchen conversation, to the months of learning each other through work and evening talk, and the ordinary accumulating revelations of shared life, to the evening on the porch when he had told her he was in love with her. She told it straight through, and Clara listened with the quality of attention that only someone who loves you completely can bring to a story. When she was done, Clara was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I was so afraid for you this past year, Theresa. After James and then the letters getting shorter and harder, I was afraid." "I was afraid too," Theresa said, "for a while. But not now." Theresa thought about it, about Homer's hand steady and careful, about William James in the cradle in the next room, about the blue dress and the fence post and the morning conversations and the whole wide ranch that had become, wholly and without question, home. "Not now," she said. The summer of 1881 moved over the ranch with its usual combination of heat and work and beauty. William James was 8 months old and had developed the habit of watching everything with the focused intensity of someone taking very careful notes about the world, which Homer found deeply satisfying and Theresa found slightly alarming given what it suggested about the personality to come. The ranch itself was doing well. Homer had made some strategic decisions about his cattle stock over the winter, consulting with Theresa extensively on the numbers, and the spring cattle sale had gone better than the year before. He had also taken on an additional hand, a man named Eli who had come from further south and who knew horses in the deep way that some men do, and the quality of the horsework on the ranch had improved measurably as a result. The shared water rights agreement with Del Harker held. There had been one incident in late spring when Harker's men had pushed more cattle through than the agreement specified, and Homer had sent a direct letter through his attorney, and Harker had pulled back without escalating further. Theresa suspected that Harker's interest in picking a fight with Homer had diminished in proportion to how clearly settled and established the Langston ranch appeared, with a family in it and a competent legal framework, and the kind of quiet, unshakable rootedness that discourages certain kinds of opportunism. On a September evening, Theresa and Homer sat on the porch in the cooling evening air as they had hundreds of times by now, and William James was asleep inside and the ranch was quiet around them, and the sky was doing its tremendous evening performance above the wide Texas land. "I have been thinking," Homer said. "About what?" "About the north section. There is a good 60 acres up there that we are not doing much with. It is fair land, could be made into something with some work." Theresa looked at the northern pasture in the evening light. "What kind of something?" "I thought we might try wheat. There are a few farms in the county doing it and the market is decent. It would diversify what we have here and give us something that is not entirely subject to the cattle market." Theresa considered this. She was quiet for a moment in the way she was when she was genuinely thinking, not building to a response but actually working through the thing itself. "You would need to break that ground," she said. "It has not been turned. And you would need someone who knows wheat farming. I know the basics, and I have been corresponding with a man in Wichita who has done it extensively on similar land. He has agreed to come and advise us. He said it naturally, without emphasis, because it was simply how he thought about the ranch now. "I think it is a sound idea," she said. "The diversification particularly." "I thought you would," he said. "You are the one who has been after me to reduce the single crop risk since March." "Cattle are not a crop. The principle holds," she smiled. "It does." She looked at the north pasture again. "Do it. I will look at the account books this week and see what we have to work with for the initial land preparation." Homer was quiet for a moment and she could hear him smiling in his silence. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just thinking about the woman who came to my door and said she could do the work of 2 people. I was right," she said. "You were so right it is almost inconvenient," he said, and she laughed. And the evening air wrapped around them both, and the land spread out in all its complicated, beautiful, difficult abundance. The wheat project moved forward through the fall and into the planning stage for the following spring. The man from Wichita, a farmer named Mac Allister with 30 years of grain experience, came and spent a week at the ranch in October, and spent most of his days walking the north section with Homer, and most of his evenings at the kitchen table with both of them, talking through soil conditions and planting schedules and water management, with a thoroughness that Theresa found genuinely engaging, and Homer found both useful and slightly amusing, given that he had not entirely expected his wife to have opinions about grain drainage patterns. She had a great many opinions about grain drainage patterns, as it turned out, and several of them were good ones, and Mac Allister treated her with the respect of a man who cares about knowing things accurately and not about where the accurate knowledge comes from. After he had gone, Homer found the notes she had taken during his visit, 12 pages in her clear, precise handwriting, organized by topic. "You took notes," he said. "I always take notes," she said. "How else are you supposed to remember anything accurately?" He looked at the notes for a long moment and then he looked at her. "I want to ask you something." "All right. I want to formally make you a partner in the ranch. Not just in the practical way that we already are, legally, on the deed." She went still. "I have talked to my attorney about it," he said. "It is entirely possible. It requires some paperwork and a filing. Your name on the deed alongside mine." He paused. "This is your home and your work, and you have built as much of what this ranch is as I have. I want the legal reality to match the actual one." She looked at him for what felt like a long time. She thought about the woman who had walked 11 miles in worn-through boots to ask a stranger for work. She thought about what it meant for that woman's name to be on the deed of this land. "Homer," she said. "Yes. Yes," she said. The filing was done in November of 1881 at the county courthouse in Caldwell Creek. The clerk read the deed change into the record with the unremarkable efficiency of a man who processes paperwork all day, and Theresa stood in the county courthouse and heard her name, Theresa Langston, formerly Redmond, read aloud as a co-owner of the land, and she kept her face composed until they were outside, and then she stood on the courthouse steps in the November air and breathed. Homer stood beside her and did not say anything, which was one of his gifts, knowing when words were the wrong tool. After a moment she said, "My father farmed land that belonged to someone else his whole life. He worked it well and cared for it and had nothing at the end of it to give his children except the example of caring for a thing as though it belonged to you even when it did not." Homer was quiet. "This is different," she said. "It is," he said. She looked out at the dusty main street of Caldwell Creek, at the familiar buildings and the familiar faces moving through the afternoon, at the wide sky above everything. "Good different," she said. "The best kind," he agreed. The years moved forward the way years do, in a place where the work is real, and the life is full. The wheat venture on the north section proved to be a measured success. Not a spectacular one, but a real one, enough to justify the investment, and add a meaningful second line to the ranch's income in years when the cattle market dipped. Homer had been right about the diversification, and Theresa had been right about the drainage, and they were both the kind of people who were honestly pleased when a plan worked out rather than primarily interested in being right about it. William James grew from a watchful baby into a watchful toddler, and then into a child of 4 and 5 and 6, who had his father's careful intensity and his mother's unintimidated directness. And the combination of these qualities created a person who was, from an early age, highly specific in his opinions and entirely comfortable expressing them. A trait that Homer regarded with fond amusement and Theresa regarded with the complicated recognition of a parent who sees their own characteristics reflected back at them. In the spring of 1884, Theresa discovered she was expecting a second child. She told Homer in the morning, before the rest of the day could get started, standing in the kitchen while the coffee was coming to a boil and the early light was coming through the east window. He turned from what he was doing and looked at her, and she watched the same expression move across his face that had moved across it the first time, the thing that was past language, past the careful containment he kept most of himself in, just feeling. "Good morning," he said, because that was Homer. "Very good," she said. This pregnancy had a different character from the first. Not easier exactly, but more familiar. She knew better what she was moving through, and there was less fear in it. William James, who was 4 and intensely interested in events, had a great many questions about the situation which she answered as honestly and clearly as possible, which was consistent with how she handled all his questions, and which he responded to well because he was a child who took honesty as a base condition and responded to vagueness with suspicion. The baby arrived in November of 1884, a girl this time, born in the same back room where Theresa had first slept when she arrived at the ranch as a stranger 5.5 years ago. They named her Margaret Clara Langston. The Clara was for Theresa's sister, and when Theresa wrote to Clara to tell her, the letter that came back was the happiest thing Clara had ever written. Margaret was different from William James from the first hour. Where William James had come into the world full of opinions and ready to argue with its arrangements, Margaret arrived with a quality that the midwife described as serene, and that Theresa recognized as something more like supreme confidence. The look of a person who is simply certain that things are going to be arranged satisfactorily. Homer held his daughter for the first time with the same careful tenderness he had brought to his son, and William James, having been very seriously informed about his new role, stood beside the bed and looked at his sister with the focused assessment of someone who is considering a significant responsibility. "She is small," he said. "She will get bigger," Theresa told him. "I know that," William James said, with the dignity of a 4-year-old who has done his research. The ranch moved forward into the years of the late 1880s, with the solidity that comes from things built right and tended carefully. Cody had married me, and they had settled on a piece of land 2 miles north that Cody had filed a homestead claim on, and he still worked for Homer 3 days a week while building his own place on the other days, an arrangement that suited everyone and meant that he and me were regular Sunday dinner guests, and that their children and the Langston children grew up in the easy proximity of people who have known each other from the beginning. Rufus, who had been old for as long as anyone could remember, retired in 1886 with a formality appropriate to the occasion. Homer gave him a pension out of the ranch accounts, enough to keep him comfortable, and a piece of land on the eastern edge of the property to build a small house on, because he had nowhere particular to go, and because the ranch had been his home for 30 years, and there was no reason to change that. Rufus accepted all of this with the same silent dignity he had brought to everything, and moved into his small house, and continued to be seen most mornings doing a slow circuit of the horse corrals, because old habits do not dissolve just because you have been given leave from them. The cattle market went through its cycles, good years and lean years, and Homer and Theresa navigated them with the shared intelligence they had been building for years. In the lean years they pulled back precisely, and in the good years they invested carefully, and there was a quality of steadiness to the ranch's finances over time that came not from luck, but from the consistent application of thought and care. Theresa had kept the account books from the first year, and they were a record now of what the ranch had been and what it had become, columns of numbers that told a story she was proud of. She was also, by the late 1880s, something of an informal authority among the women of the county on the practical business side of ranch and farm management. It happened the way most things happen, gradually and without announcement, beginning with conversations at Sunday services, and at the quilting circles that the women organized in winter, where questions about account keeping and supply ordering and the management of credit with the local merchants became subjects she found herself addressing with specificity because she had actually worked through all of these things and had things to say. She did not make a production of it. She answered questions when they were asked, and she offered perspective when it seemed useful. And over time, women came to her with real problems and trusted what she said. And she found in this something she had not expected to find: the satisfaction of being useful in a way that went beyond the immediate circle of her own household. Homer was aware of this and was entirely supportive of it in the direct, unfussy way he was supportive of things. He mentioned once that she had more practical financial knowledge than half the men in the county, and that it was a pity it was only the women who thought to ask for it. "That will change," she said. "Slowly," he said. "Most things do," she said. In 1887, a drought came. Not a quick summer drought, but the grinding, relentless kind that settles in for a season and does not leave, that turns the grass brown and the creek to a trickle, and makes the cattle lean, and makes every decision about water management a matter of real consequence. The water rights agreement with Del Harker, which had held without major incident for 8 years, became significantly more fraught. Harker wanted to exercise his access rights through September rather than ending them in August as the agreement specified, citing the drought conditions. Homer sat at the kitchen table with the original agreement, and Theresa sat across from him, and they went through it together, which was how they went through everything. "The agreement is specific," she said. "July and August." "I know," Homer said. "If you allow an extension this year, it becomes a precedent, and you will have a harder argument against extending it in future years." "I know that too." "However," Theresa said, "a drought of this severity is going to hurt Harker as badly as it hurts us. If his cattle die because he had no water access, he loses more than the inconvenience of being held to the letter of the agreement." Homer looked at her. "There is a practical argument for being generous this year," she said, "not as a concession on the rights, but as a separate arrangement with terms. A one-time extension for this drought year only, documented in writing, with Harker signing an acknowledgement that it does not alter the original agreement." Homer was quiet for a moment. "You are suggesting I do something that helps Del Harker." "I am suggesting you do something that demonstrates good faith in an extraordinary situation, which is documented in a way that protects your legal position, and which a judge would look on very favorably if this ever did come to a dispute." She paused. "It is also the right thing to do." The drought did not pick sides. Homer sat with this for a moment. Then he said, "Write it up." She wrote it up. Harker signed it 2 days later with less grace than the situation warranted, but he signed it, and his cattle had water through September, and the following spring he stopped in at the ranch unannounced for the first time in years and told Homer, without any particular warmth but with evident sincerity, that the arrangement had made a material difference to his losses. "I know," Homer said. "I do not enjoy being obligated to a man," Harker said. "You are not obligated," Homer said. "It was a separate arrangement. The agreement is the same as it always was." Harker looked at him for a moment with something complicated in his expression, and then he nodded and got back on his horse, and that was the end of it. The following year, when Harker had a dispute with a third rancher over an easement matter, he sent the man to Homer's attorney with a recommendation. Things do not always resolve in dramatic ways. Sometimes they resolve in the slow, unglamorous way of two difficult people finding the grain of practical cooperation. The drought broke in October of 1887, and the grass came back and the creek ran again, and the cattle put weight back on, and by the spring of 1888 the worst of it was behind them. William James was 8 years old that spring, old enough to begin learning the ranch in the real sense, not as a background to childhood, but as a thing being taught to him deliberately. Homer took him out on the range in the mornings when school allowed, showing him how to read the condition of cattle, how to check the fence lines, how to understand what the land was telling you about water and grass and weather. Theresa watched her son absorb these lessons with the focused intensity she had always seen in him, and felt the particular satisfaction of watching a child become who they are going to be. Margaret, who was 3, had developed a deep and unshakable attachment to the horses, and had on 2 occasions been found in the corral, standing very close to a horse that was substantially larger than her, with the confident serenity of someone who has not yet learned that this might be a concern. Eli, the horse hand, had taken to watching her with a mixture of nervousness and admiration, and had begun, in his practical way, teaching her the basics of how to approach and handle horses properly, which at least meant she was learning to do the thing she was going to do anyway in a way that was less likely to get her injured. Theresa watched all of this from the perspective of a woman who had built something she had not been able to imagine when she was walking 11 miles in worn-through boots to knock on a stranger's door. She had built a family and a home and a livelihood and a legal stake in the land under her feet. She had built a marriage that was the truest and most essential thing in her daily life, with a man who saw her completely and who she saw completely in return. And the years of living alongside someone like that had not made it smaller or more ordinary. It had made it larger, the way a fire that is properly tended grows. On a May evening in 1888, almost exactly 9 years after the morning she had first walked up the path to the ranch house, Theresa stood at the kitchen window and watched Homer come in from the South Range on horseback, the evening light behind him, William James riding beside him on the small brown mare they had bought for him at Christmas, the 2 of them talking as they rode, the easy talk of a father and son who are comfortable with each other. And the sight of it was so full of everything she had come through, and everything she had built, that she had to put her hand against the window frame for a moment. Margaret appeared at her side and looked up at her with the direct, unabashed curiosity of a 3-year-old. "Are you crying, Mama?" "A little," Theresa said honestly. "Why?" "Because I am very happy," Theresa said. Margaret considered this with the gravity of a child encountering a new concept. "That is an interesting reason to cry," she said, and went back to whatever she had been doing with her wooden blocks. That evening after supper, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Homer and Theresa sat on the porch in the warm May evening as they had done hundreds of times, and the sky overhead was full of stars and the land spread out around them in its familiar, wide, generous darkness. 9 years ago tomorrow," she said. He knew immediately what she meant. "You walked through my gate looking like you were prepared to outlast the entire territory through sheer determination." "I was. I know you were." He was quiet for a moment. "I think about that sometimes, what it took for you to do that. It was not heroic," she said. "I was hungry and I needed work, and you were the only option in a useful radius." "And now," he said. She turned to look at him. His face was in the half-dark, and she knew it so well by now, every angle and expression, the way it looked in the morning before it had arranged itself for the day, the way it looked when he was working through a problem, the way it looked when he was looking at her. "Now," she said, "you are still the only option I would ever choose." He reached over and took her hand, which he did sometimes in the evenings, simple and undemonstrative and completely right. "That is a very elegant thing to say," he said. "I thought so," she said, and he laughed. And the stars were above them and the land was below them, and everything that needed to be was settled, and everything that needed to grow was growing, and they sat in the May evening with their hands together, and the whole of their lives around them like something given freely and received with both hands. The years continued to move. The ranch grew. William James became the kind of boy, and then the kind of young man who made his parents feel that they had done something right, thoughtful and capable and honest without being rigid. Margaret became, as her early serenity had always suggested she would, a person of supreme practical competence and unexpected imagination, a combination that created someone who could fix a broken harness and then spend an hour drawing elaborate pictures in the dust with a stick, while narrating stories she was making up as she went. Clara and Hartwell came twice more over the years, and Theresa visited Missouri once with the children when William James was 10 and Margaret was 6, and she stood on the land where she had grown up and showed her children the fields her father had farmed and felt the strange, completed feeling of a circle that has been closed properly. Her father had died when she was in Abilene, before she had come to the ranch, and her mother had followed him 2 years later. She carried them with her as she carried James Redmond, in the quiet way of someone who has learned to hold loss alongside joy without letting one diminish the other. Homer's attorney, the one who had handled the water rights agreement and the deed change and various other matters over the years, was a man named Palmer who had an office in San Antonio and who came to the ranch once a year to review the legal standing of things. He had developed over the years a particular respect for Theresa that was somewhat unusual for a man of his profession in the 1880s, and that expressed itself in the specific form of addressing his correspondence to both of them rather than exclusively to Homer. "He is a practical man," Homer said once, when Theresa commented on it. "So are you," she said. "I learned from a good teacher," he said, and she had thrown a dish towel at him, which was one of the forms of marital affection available to a woman in a well-stocked kitchen. In 1891, a young woman came to the door of the Langston Ranch. She was perhaps 20 years old, thin in the way that hunger makes people thin, wearing a dress that had been mended too many times and boots that were losing their argument with the road. She had large, frightened eyes and a set jaw, and she knocked on the door with the deliberate firmness of someone using their last reserve of courage to do a necessary thing. Theresa answered the door. The young woman said, in a voice that was steady through effort, "My name is Anna Bellows. I heard in town that this ranch might be looking for help. I can cook and clean and I can do whatever work you need. I am not asking for charity. I am asking for work." Theresa stood in the doorway and looked at this young woman, and something moved through her that had no clean name but that she recognized completely. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "When did you last eat?" Anna Bellows looked at her with an expression that was trying very hard to hold itself together. "Yesterday morning," she said. "Sit down," Theresa said, and moved to the kitchen. Homer came in from the yard a few minutes later and found his wife at the stove and a young woman sitting at the kitchen table with a plate of food in front of her, eating with careful dignity. And he looked at Theresa and Theresa looked at him, and nothing needed to be said because they were the kind of people who had been married long enough to have an entire conversation in a glance. He sat down across from the young woman and said, "I am Homer Langston. This is my wife Theresa. What is your name?" "Anna Bellows," she said. "What kind of work have you done?" he asked. And while Anna told him, Theresa stood at the stove and listened and thought about worn-through boots and 11 miles of red dirt road and a man who had opened a door and given her work and wages and eventually his last name. And she thought about how things that begin in desperation can become the architecture of everything good that follows. "We can offer you work," Homer said. "Room and board and fair wages." "What kind of wages?" Anna asked, and her voice had sharpened slightly with the question, trying to be practical through her evident relief. Theresa turned from the stove and looked at the young woman with something that was very close to a smile. "We will discuss that," she said. "And you will tell me your actual worth, and we will arrive at a fair number." Anna Bellows looked at her with the uncertain expression of someone who is not sure whether to be confused or grateful. "That is how we do things here," Homer said, and there was a warmth in his voice that had a whole story inside it. That evening when the household was quiet and Anna was settled in the back room, which had been a guest room for some years now, but which Theresa had made comfortable with the same care she had wished had been brought to it when she had first slept there, Theresa and Homer sat on the porch in the summer dark. "You did not hesitate," he said. "Did you expect me to?" "No," he said. "I did not." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. She had the same look, she said, The one I had, frightened and trying not to show it and at the door anyway. Homer reached over and took her hand. You saw her coming down the road and you were already on your way to the door. I was not going to make her knock twice, Theresa said. He was quiet and she could feel him smiling in the dark the way she always could. Homer, she said. Yes. Thank you for opening your door. He turned to look at her. This woman who had walked into his life with nothing but her own formidable self, and who had become the person without whom he could not imagine any version of anything that mattered. Thank you for knocking, he said. The ranch spread out around them in the great Texas dark, the same land it had always been, patient and wide and indifferent to small human concerns, and also, somehow, full of all of them anyway. Full of the years and the work and the children's voices, and the cattle and the horses and the wheat on the north section turning gold in July, and the creek running cold and clear through the south corner in spring, and the porch where they had sat 1,000 times and would sit 1,000 times more. Theresa Langston, formerly Redmond, who had arrived at this gate hungry and alone and had asked only for work, leaned her head against her husband's shoulder and listened to the Texas night, and felt the full, settled, irreducible weight of a life that had become exactly what it was meant to be. Not because the world had been kind. The world had not always been kind. It had taken James from her too young, and it had taken her parents, and it had given her hard years and hard roads, and the particular difficulty of being a woman alone in a time and place that did not design itself for that. But she had knocked on the door anyway, and the door had opened. And everything that followed from that one hard, determined, hungry morning had built itself into this, into Homer's hand around hers, and the sound of their children breathing inside the house, and the land under the stars, and the long, unglamorous, beautiful, ordinary reality of a life made well. She would not have changed a single mile of the road that brought her here. Anna Bellows stayed at the Langston Ranch and proved, as Theresa had expected, to be exactly what she presented herself as, capable and honest and willing to work. And she stayed for 3 years before she married a young farmer from the county and went to build her own thing on her own land. And Theresa gave her a proper wedding gift and a hug that held everything she felt about what it meant to be a young woman finding her footing in a hard world. And Anna thanked her with a sincerity that needed no words. William James grew into a young man of 20 and rode the ranch with his father and was already beginning to understand it the way you understand something you are going to be responsible for, not just know, but carry. Margaret at 16 had become a horsewoman of genuine ability and a person of warm and irreverent humor, and the kind of clear moral intelligence that made you feel the future of the county was going to be in reasonable hands. Homer at 42 still ran his hand through his hair when he was thinking hard about something, and still said things he meant and meant things he said, and still sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the Texas sky do its nightly performance with the quiet appreciation of a man who has not lost the capacity to be glad of where he is. And Theresa, at 35, who had arrived at this gate with nothing but herself and had built everything else from that beginning, was co-owner of 260 acres of good Texas land, mother of 2 children who astonished her regularly, wife of the best man she had ever known, and on a Tuesday morning every spring, on the anniversary of the morning she had first walked through this gate. She stood at the front of the ranch house and looked at the path leading up from the road and thought about the woman who had walked up it 11 miles on empty boots and asked only for work. She was glad beyond all expression that she had asked. She was glad beyond all expression that he had said yes. And the ranch spread out behind her in the spring morning, wide and real and theirs, the horses in the corral and the cattle in the south pasture, and the wheat beginning to green on the north section, and the children's voices somewhere in the yard, and the whole good, complete, fully realized life of it lay around her like something she had earned and been given both at once, which is the only way the best things ever come.